Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to once again be joined by Carter Burwell. On this episode, we will focus on his work with director Martin McDonagh and, of course, cover their fourth collaboration called The Banshees of Inisherin, for which Carter has received his third Oscar nomination. It is my pleasure to welcome back Carter Burwell.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on my show again. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that. And congratulations on yet another Academy Award nomination.
Thank you.
And at first, Carter, I would like to talk about the director and, of course, about your work with him. You have done all of his films, starting with In Bruges, then Seven Psychopaths, three Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri, and now your fourth film with Martin McDonagh called The Banshees of Inisherin. And I'm curious, which aspect of his work do you find most interesting and appealing?
Well, I guess that the part that I find most interesting and appealing is that he's often dealing with fairly dark subject matter and but does it with so much humor. And it's that combination of the dark and the light that I really enjoy and appeals to me as a composer, being able to support both aspects of the film, but it allows me to sometimes play against what you're seeing because maybe what's happening is horrible. I can play the humor that's usually there somewhere, and if what's happening is lighter, I play the fact that something horrible is going to happen, eventually. But you know, putting that's putting in very simplistic terms, but I like the fact that there's almost always more than one thing happening, and that you never know when it's going to suddenly turn a corner and completely change tone.
There's a lot going on in Martin's films. I mean, they have comedic aspects, no question about it, but it's relatively dark humor, oftentimes even gallows humor, so
That's right.
it's pretty bleak at times. And but there's dramatic aspects and also a character study, if you will. Would you say that writing relatively serious music even enhances the comedy or dark humor aspects of his movies, especially Banshees?
Well, what the way it worked in Banshees is I'm not really writing specifically dark music. Actually, it's a little bit the opposite, where, we're 2 minutes into the film when you've already found out that the one guy doesn't want to see the other guy anymore. And that's basically the whole plot of the movie. The other things happen, but that is, there isn't that much more to it. Um, and the music plays basically Colin Farrell's character's outlook on life, which is, he's a happy lad. And he's a little bit of a child in the form of a man. Um, we can't imagine, for instance, him ever being married or anything like that. He's like a Disney character. He's got a miniature donkey, and he lets his horse and cattle into the house. And we spend almost the entire film watching something awful happening to him that he can't quite process, and a series of awful things. So what the music really does is, from the beginning, it plays his childlike character, the lightness of his life. But then as the film story goes on, those aspects become more ironic. And in a way, by the time we get to the end of the film, I'm still playing celeste and harp and flute, but it's playing more like Lost Innocence. It's playing ironically by the end of the film.
Whenever I listen to the music, and I listen to the album 3 or 4 times now, and I watched the film twice, and I feel like it has a special meaning as it seems to come from inside, as opposed to music which is simply put on top of images. And how extensively do you think about these things? Do you feel like you have to think about them at all, or is it just based on pure instinct?
It's a good question. I mean, I do think about these things, but in the end, I don't know if there's certainly a lot of instinct. Basically, I live when I'm working on a film, I live in that film and I'm living with those characters. from the morning into the night. I'm with them, but at the same time, I'm trying to make a film, and something which I myself, if I were in the audience, I would feel, oh, I'm having a very rich, dramatic, cinematic experience. I'm trying to somehow make it richer and more complex, and all the things that I would want if I were a viewer. So that means I do both the things that you're talking about. It's hard to, in my mind, I don't put it, I don't really separate it in that way. Although you're right, there's definitely a critical aspect. I'm thinking, about, am I saying too much in this scene? Am I saying too little? How much do I want to play exactly how people are feeling, or how much do I want to stay away from that? Um, it's but it's funny for myself. I can't really separate the two, and maybe that's just part of what it is to be a composer. I don't know. I can't really take those two apart.
Yes, and I figure it's important to get inside the head of the characters and also to add elements or to add elements to something which is not necessarily visible.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, you've just described basically the way that I would describe my job, which is to try to figure out what's not on the screen and bring that. I think definitely one part of that for this film, for Banshees, is to to couch the whole film as a little bit of a fable rather than an experience that is happening to real people in a real place in real time, because it's shot very specifically. It's shot like, where you are. You're an island off the coast of Ireland in the 1920s. There's no machinery. You don't see any cars. You could just, it's very specific about all of that. But I think one of the things music really does is try to make it a little bit less specific and to make it into a bit more of almost like a fairy tale right from the beginning, so that the very dark story that you end up in, including physically horrific bits, um, that you can distance yourself a little bit as a viewer from those and think of the whole thing a little more as an allegory. And it's one reason that's possible. Also, I have to say, hasten to say, is that the actors' performances are so real and they feel so grounded and so human that allows me to be able to step back. I don't really have to play their feelings hardly at all, because they do it so extremely well. The music kind of steps back and puts the whole story into a different context, that of some kind of like allegory.
Yes, and the acting is so marvelous in this film. And you start off with Colin Farrell, also Brendan Gleeson, two former best friends, basically. And then a complete 180 occurs, basically. And it's a tale of friendship, yet also of drama, and also even quote unquote horror a bit, because Colin's character doesn't want to, let's say, come to terms with the fact that his friend just doesn't want to associate with him anymore. And what do you think, Carter, is the moral of this story, if any?
Well, I mean, I think I'll start by saying I think that Martin he's taking a thing that is part of all of our human experience. At some point, someone has, whether from when you were 2 years old or in present day as adults, at some point, someone has said to each of us, "I don't think I want to hang out with you anymore." That's happened to everyone, and I think Martin's point of view is that that's hard for both parties. It's hard for the person who's being told to get lost, and it's hard for the person who's saying it. But then, in terms of the moral, and that's just for experiential, something we all experience. And Martin did want to investigate that in a piece of writing. But I think the other thing that's there is by making Brendan Gleeson's character a composer and musician, Martin is also asking the question, like, as a creative person, sometimes you have to tell people to get lost because you need this time and space to do your work, and and again, we've all had that experience. I certainly have it, I'm sure, and Martin has. And that, in a way, I think is the moral question that Martin tries to pose, is yeah, so what is your responsibility to your work as opposed to your responsibility to the rest of the people around you. And that's certainly the way that Brendan Gleeson's character expresses it. He's decided he doesn't have time for his dull friend, and he wants to write music specifically so that it will be left behind after he dies. And that's again, a lot of artists are familiar with that feeling. It's also like a little bit of a trap because you never know what's going to happen after you die. You could, I mean, think of all the great silent film directors, and they're how many people watch their films now? They were like on top of the world, the most important artists in the world at one time. So you just don't know what's going to happen after you die. But at the same time, I do understand that feeling as a creative person that my work is really important to me. It just is, and it's not really about what happens after I die. But I'm making things is just so essential to my life that that I do sometimes have to cut off, my family or friends. Say, sorry, I can't do anything for the next several weeks, and I just have to hope that they'll all wait around for me. That's a little bit different than saying I'm never going to talk to you again. But I think that is the moral dilemma that Martin poses in the story, and it's to the extent that he comes to a conclusion. It's at the end he said, Collins' character says, there's some things you never can get past, and maybe that's a good thing. Now, I don't know why that's a good thing. I don't agree with that point of view, but I guess that's kind of the question that you're left with. Do you think these people will ever? I mean, obviously they're going to live on the island together for the rest of their lives.
Well, basically at the end, Brandon's house was burned down by Colin Farrell, and they were still talking to each other at the beach. So
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think you've got it right. I mean, that's right. They're gonna pretend not to speak to each other, but yet they will still be speaking to each other. I think that's probably a safe bet. Yeah.
yes, and so many horrible things happened throughout the course of the film, and also it's a very sad story. I must say the film it stuck with me. It really has stuck with me. I think it's a tremendous movie, and it has so much to show for basically, and I think Martin is a wonderful storyteller. And I'm curious, does he use temp music? Does he believe in that concept at all?
Well, I think that he before he even shot the film, he had a few pieces of pre-existing music that he he wanted to get into the film somewhere, and I don't think he was even sure where. But and one is the Bulgarian women's song that's at the very beginning of the movie. Um, there's two pieces of Brahms lieder that are in the film, and there was also an Indonesian gamelan piece that was in a montage at the very middle of the film. He had those in mind before he even shot, and then when I saw the first cut, he had put those in, and and they make kind of a strange puzzle because how do we get from Bulgarian to German leader to Indonesian and then my score to and the Irish fiddling. Those are the pieces he had in mind, and it wasn't so much like temp music because he had them in mind before he even made the film. Um, but his editor then Mikkel put in some Carl Orff. I think there was some. A lot of the times, it's the film editor actually puts temp music into the film while they're editing. They just like some kind of sense of pace and some it helps them to create a thread that runs through a scene. So it actually, I don't know how much it has to do with Martin at all, but there was a bunch of, it was mostly Carl Orff that they had laid in certain areas, but there was also a lot that didn't have, I'd say half the film didn't have temp when I first saw it. I personally preferred not to have temp music in a film, but as I say, I can't really. And sometimes I say, well, can you please just let me see the film the first time without temp? And I think they may have done that for me on this one, pulled the temp out for my the first viewing, but I can't really make them not cut to it if that's what they want to do.
I must say, I really enjoyed the principal themes of this film, which can be heard in the cues Walking Home and also Night Falls on Inisherin, and then you hear the different variations as the score progresses. And if I recall correctly, in a previous interview, you yourself have described the music as quote unquote relatively simple. Yet it is very effective. And how do you find the essence in a simple sequence of notes?
Well, it's a good question. The music is simple in that if you looked at it on the page, like the notes on the page, you would say, this is really very simple. But at the same time, it's not simple in that um, often the harmonic language is what we call chromatic. It's not one of those main themes, the walking home theme. As it develops, it's neither in a major nor a minor mode. It switches with such fluidity and awkwardness sometimes that you call it chromatic. And so even those few notes on the page, in musicological terms, it's a little more complicated than it sounds, but it has to appear simple because it's playing Colin's character, who is simple. So it gives the appearance of simplicity. And then the other part of it is that the most noticeable melody notes are being played by celeste, maybe harp, and they're like child instruments, right? Almost, and very kind of pretty, sparkly instruments. But down below that, there's marimba, and then down below that, there's gamelan gongs, and at the very bottom, the pizzicato bass. And so there is this sort of darkness lurking beneath. And the gamelan in particular has these non-harmonic overtones, which are just hard to put your finger on, especially as a Western listener. And so I think, again, it's simple on the page and it's not a lot of instruments. When I went to record it, I look in the room and like, 8 people there or something. Sometimes we had more, but often not. If you try to analyze the music a little bit more, it becomes a little less simple, despite the appearance. It has the appearance of simplicity.
Yeah, and I think it's deceptively simple. I personally wouldn't call my favorite theme of the film simple. Dun 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 dun. I wouldn't call that simple. It's very maybe in musical terms, but in terms of what it brings across and what it does with the characters and the film and what it is supposed to do, you did a very good job. Colin Farrell's character in this film wonders if he is dull, as in boring or dumb, stupid, dim-witted, but he certainly is not. At least I wouldn't go as far as to call him that. And the same can be applied or said about the music, but it has many different layers, I think.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's what I'm trying to say too. You said it maybe better than I did, but that's right. And yeah, I want it to seem simple at first because otherwise it's not going to suit his character. But there has to be enough. There have to be enough layers so that as the story progresses and it goes down a fairly dark path, that you know, it's the music is still working. And indeed the music, even when we start the movie with a rainbow and we end it with a smoldering house, the music doesn't change that much from the beginning to the end. I mean, it develops in certain areas, like when Siobhan, the sister, leaves the island. That's probably our most emotional piece of music. But even there, it's still very simple, I'd have to say. And I think that the music, by maintaining those same themes and same instrumentation, does suggest that whatever is going on has always been true. It's like always been there on the island. This like some dark thing that's probably lurking there, or there's an aspect of just our species of humanity. It's just always going to be like this, and that indeed after the movie ends, it will continue to be like this. And that was another idea that I had, that it wouldn't at the end have developed into some different theme where basically it's still very, very similar to the beginning.
Do you think it can be important or maybe even stifling at times to really analyze every note? Or do you think that you or Martin embrace a certain element of unexpectedness?
Oh, I think we embrace a lot of unexpectedness. Yes, and I don't think, despite everything that I've just that I've said during this entire interview, we don't really analyze it while we're doing it. Like everything I've just said is the result of having listened back to the music and done a lot of these interviews and like, where I have to, try to analyze it and explain it. But that's not the way I'm actually working as a creative person. It's a lot more instinctual, trial and error. Yeah, I mean, it's emotional. It's an emotional language, music. So I don't find, despite, like I say, despite everything I've just said, I don't find myself doing, really almost any kind of an analysis while I'm writing the music. And right up through the recording, that's the case. And it's only when the film is done and it's out there and people start asking me questions about it, then I put on my analytical hat and start looking at it that way. But that's not part of my actual work process. I will say one thing that, with regard to that, for instance, I was halfway through the score when I was reading Grimm's fairy tales to my daughter one day, and we were reading Cinderella, and in the Grimm's version of Cinderella, the stepmother makes her daughters cut off pieces of their feet to fit into the slipper that the prince found. And I was reading that to my daughter, and I thought, wow, this reminds me of the movie I'm working on. And that's when I realized that part of what the music was doing in Banshees, I'd already written most of it, but part of what it was doing was turning it into a fable, and that there was a value in that. But until I'd had that experience of reading to my daughter, I didn't even really realize that's what I was doing. I knew that I liked what the music was doing, but I couldn't have exactly told you why until then. And then was able to reflect and say, oh, kind of turning this into a fable. That kind of works. I think I understand why I like the celeste and the gamelan and these sounds. They kind of make it a little otherworldly. And so anyway, and the analysis comes sporadically, but that's not the way that I actually create music.
Carter, thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule to talk to me about the great work on this picture. I had a great time doing another interview, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
I did indeed.
And thank you very much for your contributions to the world of film music. I think everyone out there appreciates it. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to chatting again soon.
All right. Thank you, Michael. I look forward to it too.